Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Security Champions podcast. I'm your host, Dustin Lair, and I am here with Ariel Shin. How are you doing today, Ariel?
Good. Thank you so much for having me on.
Absolutely. So just a quick caveat before we get started, I want to say that the things we talk about on the show are our own opinions and do not represent the opinions of our employers. And with that, let's dive in. So Ariel, I want to get to know you a little bit more. I would love for the audience to get to know you a little bit more as well. Do you want to just share more about your background, your career? How did you get into cybersecurity and all of that?
Definitely. So I graduated with a comp sci degree, and then my first job out of college was as a pen tester at a consulting firm. And so I was based out of Texas, and a lot of our contracts were small to mid-sized companies. So that meant I was actually finding a lot of very textbook-like vulnerabilities, which was really great because I felt like I was getting a lot of practice and understanding a wide variety of vulnerabilities and how to find them in the wild to an extent. And so then I switched over to appsec primarily because after 1 year, I was finding the same exact vulnerabilities. And I felt like I wanted to be part of the solution. How do I help developers actually solve a lot of these vulnerabilities and get to the root cause? And so I worked on the appsec team at One Medical, where I did a lot of work with their mobile app. And then I moved over to Segment, which had been acquired by Twilio, where I was on the appsec team for a couple of years there and got to work as part of the Segment team and then as part of the wider Twilio team. That was also when I transitioned over from an IC to a manager, and I managed a small team. And then I moved over to Datadog, where I managed an appsec team. And then recently I transitioned back to an IC at Stripe, where I now work on the security partnerships team.
That is interesting. So IC to manager to IC. I would love to talk about that a little bit more, but I also want to, before we get there, you said something that I thought was really interesting, and that's you moved essentially from red team to blue team, right? You moved from just like finding issues, dropping that nugget, walking away. Good luck. I'm not sure what you're going to do about that one, but good luck, to wanting to actually contribute to fixing the issues. Why that move? I think that's really cool.
So it was, in the beginning, pen testing was a lot of fun for me because I was learning a lot. I was studying for a lot of different certifications, and the studying actually felt very active in that I could apply it to my day-to-day. It wasn't like school where I was like, I don't know how any of this is going to have a real-world application. I'd learned new techniques for SQL injection, and that I'd actually be able to apply that in my day-to-day. And so I really loved that part of learning, is that I would get that instant gratification to an extent where I'd see that vulnerability. But that gratification started to die off, where there were diminishing returns to an extent where I didn't find the value of finding those vulnerabilities again and again and again. It started to feel a little sad to find these same exact ones. And it was because I wasn't part of the solution. I was just finding the problems. I'd give a report. I'm not sure how well read that report was or how they were going to integrate it. And there wasn't a lot of context for the developers as well. And so sometimes we'd have these 30-minute or 1 hour follow-ups with the engineering teams where we talk through these solutions and how they could best integrate that. And so oftentimes that felt really limited. And so I did really want to join an application security team because I'd primarily been working on web app pen test and work with those engineers, show and demonstrate developer empathy and work with them to figure out the solution, get some context, build out these programs that can ensure that we can solve these problems at scale.
Yeah, I think what I find most fascinating about that is you will find some breakers, right? Red teamers who they're red teamers for life, right? Like they enjoy breaking things. That's why they get into it to begin with. And then they just continue down that path. And then you would find people who are potentially, builders who find the break side, right? They essentially go from blue team to red team because they're like, oh, this is fascinating. I want to be a hacker or whatever it is. But I think it's fascinating that you went essentially the opposite direction, right? You're like, okay, breaking things, yeah, that's fun, but I want to be part of the solution. I think that says a lot about you as an individual as well, that it's, you don't just want to go break stuff. You want to be part of coming up with the fixes at the end of the day. So I think that's awesome. Tell me more about this transition. We work hard to get to leadership positions, right? It's a lot of work, and it's a lot of demonstrating your value and then not to mention once you get in to be a manager, learning how to be a manager, right? So tell me about that journey. Like, what did it take to get in? What was it like as a manager, and why go back to be an IC after that?
Definitely. So very early on, I always knew I wanted to be a manager. There was just some qualities that I really enjoyed in kind of helping improve as a whole, becoming a multiplier for the team, sometimes acting as that like glue work. And so just kind of bringing the team together, getting the team to move together as a whole forward, building relationships with different team members, working cross collaboratively. And the biggest thing is I really enjoyed mentoring folks, getting folks from point A to point B in their career. And so that was something that I wanted to create a career out of. And so management seemed like the right track for me. And that was something I'd always expressed to my managers when I'd worked with them early on, so I could get a lot of exposure to what types of work they were doing. And so when I made the transition, I'd worked with a manager, Jeevan, who you know, who was really amazing at helping me with those first steps. He knew that the transition was huge and wanted to help me in just getting some of those baby steps in. And so I worked as a team lead first. And so that meant I was working with a smaller set of responsibilities. I had 2 direct reports. We had a very specific scope. And I was getting a lot of support from him, peer managers, and my skip level. So I was also, I had also been at that company for a couple of years. And so I understood the role really well. I understood the organization really well. I understood the tech stack very well. And so that meant that I could easily move between IC and team lead roles really easily. And so when I did have a new challenge, so going through calibrations for the first time, I could lean on peers or the relationships I had already built. And so I felt really protected in this role. And at times I felt, okay, I want to be challenged more. I want to now become a manager in a foreign land where I don't understand, where I don't have the political or social capital built up, where I don't have those relationships, where I'm building a team from scratch, because that's really where I'll learn and be tested as a manager, right? Because I'll be hiring, I'll be kind of working with different folks. There's so many different aspects of management that I'd get exposed to. But ultimately, it wasn't the right fit for me at that time, where I didn't feel I was learning in the way that I needed or had all the resources I need to be the best possible version of myself. And I was also, I felt I didn't have the technical depth that I needed, where technical breadth is one thing, where kind of you can talk to me broadly about different security topics. And I may have some experience, or I can pull from working with others, or just had read something, but I was missing some of that technical depth. And so when I was coming in with a brand new team, that wasn't something I could necessarily deliver. And so that was a big learning for me. And so it was, maybe I actually want to go back into being an IC. There are a lot of changes happening currently in the industry with AI. And I would love to learn about what does it mean to secure an MCP server internally and externally. As a manager, I'd help manage that project and help work with the ICs working on it. But I wouldn't directly learn and interact with the developers and have to make some of those decisions that I felt would help me understand and learn a lot better. And so went back into being an IC, and I'm really happy because I'm back in that like growth mindset and learning a lot about different and new technologies.
Yeah, I think we all have to make these hard decisions ourselves in terms of what we sacrifice to be a manager versus an IC. It's something that I struggled with a lot as well. Like I was an IC for, many years as a developer and so forth. And I did feel like this technical depth that you're talking about was lacking, and it was a worry of mine. As a manager, I have other concerns. I can't spend as much time on certain things. Therefore, I will be, over time especially, less and less effective in terms of understanding the actual technical details. I have to sort of, learn by proxy to some degree, right? Because my engineers know it in detail. I just need to sort of understand it at a higher level. And that can be really hard to deal with. So I certainly understand the decision, right, to move back to IC and wanting to get back into the details, especially around AI and so forth. You opened up quite a can of worms there. Like I wrote a lot of different notes. So I think there's a lot to talk about, but I need to take a short break for our sponsor. So we'll be right back. Stay tuned.
Calling all security champions and program leaders. Kick off Cybersecurity Awareness Month with the Security Champions Summit, a 2-day virtual event packed with actionable insight and community connection. Whether you're a security champion, launching a program, or scaling it up, you'll leave with field guides, templates, and a plan you can put into action immediately. Plus, join the pre-event tournament for prizes and bragging rights. Spots are limited, so save yours now. Check the episode description for the registration link.
All right, and we are back with Ariel Shin, and I am so excited to get back into it and talk more about the details that we've sort of uncovered in the first part of this episode. One of the things that you said is, as a manager, you acted as glue. And I would love to talk about that more, especially because that's essentially how a recent, I believe it was a panel at B-Sides, was titled AppSec as glue. So there's a little bit of this theme going on here in terms of glue, and maybe you can explain what you mean by that. You know, what does acting as glue essentially mean to you? Definitely.
So there's actually so much to talk about when talking about glue work, but really that term, I believe, was coined by Tanya Riley. She has a book, and a couple of books, but also a blog where she details this noidea.dog/glue. And when I first read this article, it was mind-blowing to me because I was like, I can't believe a lot of the work I've been doing was glue work. And one thing that they talk about glue work is they can also be referred to as non-promotable tasks, especially as an IC. You do a lot of the work to kind of bring the team together. That's maybe cleaning up the documentation or kind of helping around with some of these team meetings. So her blog goes into a lot more depth of it, but at times it's you pick up these tasks that are needed to keep the team functioning, but don't necessarily demonstrate a clear impact in terms of like your engineering work. And so it can be dangerous at times, especially earlier in your career as an IC, to pick up too much glue work. But at the same time, a lot of our work is glue work, where especially as appsec practitioners, we're bringing people together, we're gluing teams together, we're finding out how to bridge it. And so the way I've interpreted glue work is really it's these broader set of skills that you can have. And there are moments in which it can help you really kind of build that social capital needed, bring together groups of people to get work done. But there are other times where spending too much time on it can actually be detrimental to your career because it distracts you from some of that imminent impact that you need to land.
So that's fascinating. I am curious if, as a manager and as an appsec leader or even just an engineer, if more of the job is glue work, and if it is perceived as more beneficial or productive to focus on that glue work. Does that make sense? Like you were saying, as an IC, perhaps spending too much time on glue work is not a good thing. But is there more room for working on that as a manager, as an appsec professional?
I think it depends. It really depends on your kind of how you deliver impact as a manager, and that really differs company by company. And so there are some managers that will get rewarded for doing a lot of that glue work, and maybe it'll show up in some of the like qualitative measures, like whenever they have like a survey, it's like, do you feel like your team's a well-functioning team? Doing a lot of that glue work will show up and your manager will then get rewarded. But there are other times where that doesn't show up because a manager is kind of measured on different things such as like technical depth and breadth, right? Where they want that manager to be a lot more technical, a lot more hands-on. And so that means they're the ones shipping some code at times. That's not going to be the manager that you want to be doing a lot of glue work to an extent.
Can you describe maybe in more detail what is considered glue work? So shipping code is not glue work. What is glue work?
So I think maybe I'm also conflating a couple of terms of I really see glue work as like some of the tasks that get missed. And so like on a team, writing good documentation, cleaning up documentation, that would be considered glue work, right? It's like it helps your team become well functioning and work together, but it doesn't necessarily land impact for you alone. And so when we talked about AppSec as glue, we had just kind of rephrased. It was a bit of a catchy title as well of some of the ways that we have AppSec like come together to like bring together different parts of the org and all of the collaboration that we do in order to kind of move an agenda forward or move like different cultural pieces or programs forward.
I see. So this kind of aligns with something I like to talk about, and that's that there's a lot of visibility that the AppSec team has across different teams and silos and even like business verticals where we can help connect those dots, right? If there could be certain engineering teams that don't talk to each other that are building similar things, as an example, or even just, hey, there's a whole project in this other business unit that's unaware, right, of another project that's very similar in a different business unit. And since we have that visibility, we can kind of connect those dots and connect those teams and say, hey, did you know that this team is actually working on this? No, I didn't. Well, maybe you guys should talk because it might be more productive to work on it together instead of separately. Is that considered glue work? Is that kind of what you're talking about?
That's exactly what I'm thinking about as well. It's really the having that visibility within the org and like gluing together different pieces of the org. And that skill is something that AppSec folks get really used to because we work with so many different partners. We build so many different relationships. We're not just about like getting the work done or enabling people really quickly, but also building strong relationships that we can lean on again and again.
Well, there's a key word, building relationships. And this is kind of related to a question that I want to ask, and that was, how does this glue work when it comes to gluing together developers and AppSec? Like, is there glue work involved in that? You mentioned building relationships. What are some of your thoughts around that? Like, how do we get more developers involved? Should we get more developers involved? What are your thoughts?
So I go back and forth on this topic on like how do we build relationships well and how do we scale an AppSec program, right? Because there's one piece where you want more bang for your buck to an extent where you want to do less work and see a lot more impact. And so that's fewer meetings with developers, but you start to see a lot of like security positives within your org. But that goes directly against building strong, meaningful, long-lasting relationships with developers because that means you're really putting in the time to understand the context of the problem, understand their constraints, and work with them on a solution. And sometimes you're embedding with their teams. You're putting a lot of time to help one team, and you're not sure that that impact will be long-lasting. And so I go back and forth as to when we like to use these different tools, because I do see all of these as like tools in a toolbox where you're trying to identify which tool works for the specific problem that you have.
Yeah, there's a balance there, and I agree. I would love to give our audience more specifics if you have them in terms of what types of things should they be focused on, right? What is the balance that they should aim for? What is good relationship building look like that is worth your time versus spending your time more on automation, right? Or setting up processes, et cetera, that just sort of make it seamless. So if we could go into a little bit more depth there and you could provide more specifics, that'd be fantastic.
So I think this also comes down to how an AppSec team is structured, where you can have a mix where some folks are doing both the threat modeling and the building, or you may also have a team where they split up those two functions, where you have a team that builds and a team that threat models. But let's just think of it as like a classic AppSec engineer in terms of like job postings where you're expected to do both, right? You're expected to build, you're expected to manage security tooling, and you're expected to do threat modeling. How do you balance all of that? And so what I've seen is oftentimes you'll have a threat modeling ticket assigned to you maybe once every like 2 weeks or a month that you're working on in addition to like a big project. And so in that situation, the way I would focus on like building those relationships is trying to find what are the products or services that I have an affinity towards that I'm building relationships long term. So I'm going to gravitate working with the same team or org. So anytime that they have a request coming in, I'm going to continue to build on that relationship. And I think that's a really organic way to build meaningful relationships while also still completing those threat models. And then you balance that with your project work. And so oftentimes you may be working on a project that requires expertise or influence or buy-in from an engineering team. And hopefully you've kind of built these affinities with different groups and that you can lean on them to then kind of influence your project as well.
So very goal oriented, like we have a specific initiative we're trying to roll out. I have an existing relationship with my own business vertical, whatever it is. So therefore, this is an opportunity to build on the relationship that I've already created and then hopefully strengthen that right through this project. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And this is a model that I've seen and used myself as well. And that's assigning like partners, like appsec engineers that are focused on a specific area. There's so much benefit there because they're learning the domain as appsec engineers, but also the teams that they're working with know them as their appsec person, right? Their go-to person instead of trying to, cover all projects from all engineers, which I think is really effective. So have you seen a similar model to that? And is that kind of what you were talking about in terms of a good way to build that relationship?
I think there's like a spectrum of like how formalized that program can be, because let's say you have 5 AppSec engineers and you split up the entire org into like 5 different sections. Now you have really overwhelmed AppSec engineers because they have a fifth of the entire organization on their shoulders, and that can be really difficult. I've also seen it where it's been like really informal. And so it's like, oh, this person like really loves to work with like OAuth. And so like all the OAuth questions are going over to them. And then they're like, oh, maybe we should have a second person for when that person's out on vacation. And so they try adding a second person, and it's a lot more like organic, but they're like attempting to formalize it a lot more. I've seen a huge variety, and I don't think there's a perfect formula for every organization because they all differ by size. We've had some instances where we said, okay, we can't split up the org into 5 different factions. So what we'll do is we'll focus on just the critical businesses. And then what we saw was that the businesses that we are like generating a lot of revenue are actually not the ones that attackers are going after. They're going after the front door. And so they don't care which one which specific product like generates the most revenue for us. They're looking specifically at what's the path of least resistance. And so I haven't found a perfect formula, but I think like iterating on it and adapting it to your org is really important, in that organically you're going to start to find folks who are interested in a specific area. And so constantly like fostering that growth mindset of like, let's continue to learn and understand different parts of the org, continue to build those relationships. And when we do formalize, let's get feedback on how we can continue to improve that program. So if we're finding that we focused on the wrong 20% of the org, how do we get better about maybe using data to figure out which parts of the org we should focus on? And then how do we expand that out?
Yeah, I love what you're saying there. And I think it sort of comes down to how attackers are viewing the org as opposed to how you view yourselves, right? And I agree, there are challenges with that entire model that come down to, knowledge in a lot of cases too, because if you're responsible for all the security, right, of one vertical or being that resource, then any sort of questions that come across, you're sort of responsible for knowing whether or not you have an interest in even knowing. And that's where I always talked about it in terms of, but we're a team, so we need to make sure that we're supporting each other too. If you've got someone that has expertise that someone else is missing and they get a question, utilize your teammate, bring them in. There's nothing wrong with that. You're not alone. So you mentioned threat modeling, and I know that this is a buzzword in addition to shift left at this point. What are your thoughts about threat modeling in general, the challenges of it, whether it's worth pursuing? What are the different situations that you've seen? Yeah,
I do think that threat modeling has kind of become this I want to say overloaded, but maybe it's become a little bit of a cliche where there are some folks who distrust it. Right? They've been in a lot of orgs where there's been a lot of threat modeling, a lot of resources for threat modeling, or threat modeling wasn't being done fast enough. And they start to question the value. Like, why is threat modeling important? I need you to justify it to me in terms of metrics. I need you to translate that into OKRs. And that's not always something that's easy to do. Where on paper, the way we describe threat modeling being important is that it just, in the design phase, it is cheaper and easier for us to identify those risks and mitigate or prevent them from becoming like realized risks. So a lot of people say, okay, but why? Why does that matter? And they keep kind of pressing further. And it starts to, you get into these sort of conversations where it's, how does it save us dollars, or how does it prevent us from the next incident? Can you prove that through metrics that because you threat modeled, you prevented X number of incidents? And I've seen a lot of tooling where it's really, really difficult to show metrics, good metrics in terms of meaningful metrics to your org and your leadership that threat modeling is important, because at the end of the day, we often choose like number of threat models completed, kind of percentage of the org that's been covered by a recent threat model. And oftentimes the only feedback that you're getting is do more, cover more of the org faster, more comprehensively. And it kind of misses the point of threat modeling, in my opinion, because it's when we engage in these threat models through where a human is coming in and they're identifying risks with the engineers, and the engineers going through the process of kind of looking through their design and also providing feedback and context to the security engineer, you're able to mitigate some of these concerns, and they may not become like tangible tickets or like realized tickets. They may have just been a quick discussion of like, yeah, we probably shouldn't do that in the design, or let's skip that portion for now. And that actually had prevented an incident. It had prevented a headline, and that's not something that like we're keeping tallies of. And so it looks like we're not shipping like X number of threat modeled features, like that becomes less important. It's really about some of those things that very quickly, very easily, within one sentence, we're able to prevent a major design flaw that would have led to an incident. And that is really hard to measure.
That is very well said, and that happens all the time. And I think that this is the case that folks make, that it's much cheaper, right, to find something early in the dev life cycle versus later, because it might be some random thought that somebody has. Why don't we do it like this during a conversation? And then you sort of talk about it and you decide to do it or not. And that decision could have potentially major impacts down the line. But how do you prove that? How do you demonstrate that? So what are some of the ways that you've gone down this path of trying to prove that threat modeling is not just surface level, we threat model, we don't, how many threat models have we produced, but trying to show an actual risk reduction impact? Have you found some success there?
So the ones I personally love the most is a shipped email from the engineering team that calls out the security team that worked with them. I think that's really, really meaningful because it speaks on two things. One is we ship something securely. Two, an engineering team is calling this out, right? Because of that meaningful relationship that was built. And also gives visibility, right? To, especially if this is like a particularly big ship, right? There might be engineering leadership that has eyes on this. And so those are my favorite of where I think like collecting those emails, especially for your performance reviews, are really great. And so the way that we kind of on the security side can do a really great job of that is recognizing strong security partners when an engineering team goes above and beyond. I think that recognition is really important. And the other piece is recognizing those big threat models that were done, keeping track of those. It's not just the volume, but also just the impact the security review had on that design.
Yeah, that's fantastic to get called out like that. Do you prompt for that, or have you prompted for that?
No.
Does this make sense? Okay. So
no.
Completely organic, like it just
that's when it's my favorite.
To mention, yeah, that's your favorite.
It's completely organic, and they call you out, and that is the best feeling ever for me, and that is something that I always really love to highlight when I see it for others as well. It's because the engineering team is going out of their way to recognize the impact security had on them and why that relationship is so important.
Yeah, I love that too. I do wonder, though, if leadership needs to see potentially more than that, because this could happen or not, and you're not necessarily in control of that. So have you ever pursued some sort of like survey coming out of a threat modeling activity, something like that? Was this useful? Do you think, asking them specifically, do you think we avoided a security issue in our architecture because of this threat modeling session, right? Something like that you can show management.
I'm laughing a little bit because I did just that and it didn't work out the way I expected, where at the end of every threat modeling ticket I created, there's like this closing screen you can create in Jira. And I think I made a question along the lines of like, did you think this like positively impacted the organization? Like something along those lines. And there was like a comment section. And I purposely left it as like yes, no, or like no answer. And very, very few people went through the effort to write yes or no. I forget which conference it was at, but they had put out at the end of every talk, you could put like a red square or like a green square. And I was at a talk where like someone was leaving early and the presenter called them out and was like, if you're going to leave early, at least put a little thing in. And they put a red in front of and it was just became this whole thing. And I don't know. I think like when you ask, the more you ask people questions about things, the more noise it becomes. And so that's why it's also really, really hard to consistently gather feedback on things like that, because you don't know what that signal is like. It becomes a lot of noise. Like we're so used to getting all these like survey requests. Like I have so many different apps that like anytime I want to use it, they're like making me answer a survey and it's frustrating me. And I worry about doing that to users as well. One thing I really love as a measurement though, because it's less in your face, is something called like a net promoter score, and which is how likely are you to recommend this to someone else? And so instead of measuring what someone responded on a survey, one way you could take that is how many like re-requests did they have? So like how many additional threat models in this org, especially because in most organizations, threat models are voluntary. And so you track kind of based off of like the first intake or like the first kind of like deep relationship that was built is how often do they keep coming back for additional threat models?
Yeah, I like that. And I always warn folks to not overuse surveys because they're not necessarily that accurate. Like they don't demonstrate what people are necessarily actually thinking. There's a lot of reasons and incentives to answer a certain way no matter what. Did you find this useful? If you say no, now you're kind of sitting there like, well, if I say no, then am I expressing that I don't think security is important, or that someone did a bad job or something like that? Like there's all these other implications for answering a certain way versus the other, and that interferes with the results, right? Because now you're looking at that like, well, was this a valid question, and did people answer a certain way because they were incentivized? So yeah, there are certainly issues there. One of the things that I've recommended using in terms of threat modeling and demonstrating that threat modeling is worth it is almost a before and after timing. Like we had incidents, we had this sort of architectural issue that we ran across consistently. Then we implemented threat modeling and we saw a reduction in those types of issues, and you can sort of demonstrate that to leadership. Have you used anything that looked like that?
So I don't think so. I think that I've always worked at companies where like threat modeling has always played a role. And the argument that I hear isn't like, should we threat model or not threat model, but is why is threat modeling more valuable than all the other stuff that we're doing, right? Because oftentimes you're not talking about threat modeling in isolation. You're talking about threat modeling when we have all of this great tooling, when you can buy more tokens and, maybe purchase like threat modeling tooling. Like people do at the end of the day say like threat modeling is important, but why do you resource it with full-time engineers that work on chatting with engineers throughout their designs and then filing tickets perhaps? Like that's where we get into this. How much resources should you put towards threat modeling becomes the question. And it's, should you reduce some of those manual resources and invest in automated, because we have great success with all of this other tooling that we have.
Yeah, invest in automation, invest in maybe AI which might solve all of our problems there, right? So I think you opened up a can of worms for us to talk about around why is threat modeling more valuable than the other things we're doing. How does that, and I would be certainly remiss if we don't start to talk about AI to some degree in this conversation. Do you have similar concerns around that? Like, are we, spending more time than we should looking at AI, or how do we sort of justify that all of the focus on AI is more valuable than some of the other things that we could be doing?
So I'm a bit more cautious about the role that AI plays in security and the kind of the overhyped impact that gets talked about a lot. One thing I will say is like I do strongly believe that making a lot of the moves now is like important because I've been hearing this term, it's a perishable opportunity. That oftentimes people want to become big players in the AI space or kind of their specific market. They want to make their name and really kind of play a huge role and really advance kind of AI forward there. And so they see it as a perishable opportunity that you must act now. And I think that a lot of the big players will be cemented now for the next decade plus. And so it's really, really important that folks do get involved with AI and that they do move really quickly. But at the same time, I think that there may be stuff like that have longer shelf life that are starting to expire if we don't take a look now. And there are issues that we often talk about, like, okay, hey, we need a better supply chain security strategy, and it's been ignored for a really, really long time. And oftentimes, like that can become a big issue. And so it's really balancing our priorities as an organization. I know that's something that leaders try to do frequently of, okay, how do we assess our current threat landscape and the resources we have to figure out what our priorities are for this year? And for a lot of companies, AI has become first. And we see how we can apply AI within application security. And we're being sold a lot of, I think, like just like these like fantasy land solutions that I don't fully believe in just yet.
So you're coming at this with a fair amount of skepticism, healthy, probably skepticism, which I think is fantastic. You mentioned that there could be other things that have a longer shelf life, like perhaps supply chain security. How do you determine that? Like, what are your thoughts and what led you to that as an example, right?
Oh, I completely just stole this from a B-sides question from last year. I think someone on my panel had asked, like, if we were to believe that AI is to be overhyped, what is something that's being missed? And then someone on the panel answered supply chain security. And I thought that was a great response where it's really hard oftentimes as a security org. We lack visibility into our most imminent threats. Oftentimes, like one of my favorite programs, Bug Bounty, is often overlooked. It's really hard to connect the findings and have that fuel our priorities. We just kind of take the findings, we triage it, we remediate it, and that's about it. We don't actually take that data and use that to say, okay, we're going to make, let's say, I think like on OWASP and for many like bug bounty findings, like broken access control is huge. Like we're going to focus on solving broken access control this year. That's really difficult. Is we're getting a lot of, there's always different competing priorities. And I've seen that at previous organizations where we would focus on, instead of a specific class of findings, let's focus on different parts of the organization because we need to enable them more quickly. And that makes a lot of sense to me as an organization. We need to be able to enable specific parts of the org a lot faster than solving this like long-term problem that we've had for decades and we haven't seen this huge fallout just yet. We're going to continue to make more money for the business than prevent this like imminent harm that we're not so sure is imminent.
Yeah, I was just talking to someone about this today. Like, how do you demonstrate that something is a high enough risk that it deserves your attention at the end of the day? Okay, great. I've got critical vulnerabilities in legacy systems, but they've been sitting there for 10 years and we haven't really seen an impact. So is this suddenly a priority that we go fix those when we haven't actually seen an impact? Right. So if you want to, I don't know, expand on that, but you also mentioned.
But that's what I'm talking about. Like the shelf life is expiring on those, right? It's like, we've had them for 10 years. What's telling us that we can have it for another 10 years and do nothing with it? Those are the things that because we're focused on those perishable opportunities, we're not thinking about the items in the back of our cupboards that are starting to expire and may explode.
And that's where supply chain security really comes in. Yeah, I think that's a really good example. You mentioned overhyped, potentially, AI solutions that are out there, and the perishable opportunity. I would love to get into that more, because I'm curious what fantasy land looks like to you. What do you mean by that? What do you consider fantasy land in AI versus something that's more practical?
I think right now we're being sold a lot of the potential benefits that AI can solve a lot of these problems. And I do see a lot of great advancements made. I think I saw Uber recently released their AI code review, and Claude has their AI code review as well. And so there are a lot of really, really great advances coming out. But the way that the kind of mental model I've created for now is that it replaces what Tynes would have done, in which you wanted to solve a problem that's repeatable, very clear, can be solved with clear instructions. You would oftentimes use something like Tynes. You would go for a no-code solution. That's really the problems that AI can solve really well, at least for now. And so that's where I do think the value's there. It is worth spending your time in automating this repeatable activity that you do, that will provide a lot of value. But I don't think it'll solve everything. I do think that there are hallucinations, there are a lot of concerns that come out that we don't fully have the answers just yet, or at least mature answers as to how we want to deal with it.
Yeah, and you're talking about it in terms of current state and applying kind of your critical thinking to what extent does AI fill in some of the gaps right now. But I'm also curious about what you think the potential is and where we might be headed in the future with AI.
I'm really skeptical about the future. I think we were chatting earlier about there's been a study that I've read that I love, which is it's on METR. I think I had read it on Hacker News, where they'd done a study with experienced developers to see if it increased their productivity to use AI while solving these bugs in an open source repository. So I may be saying some of these details wrong, but basically experienced developers, half of them were using AI and half of them were not using AI. And they found that for most engineers, AI did not help them. It actually hindered them, except for one outlier. There was one engineer who worked really closely with AI, and so he understood the limitations of AI, and he also knew how to context switch really well. So there were some engineers who would prompt, I think, cursor, and it would just, they'd be waiting forever. The solution didn't work. They're kind of back in that loop of just waiting for the solution to work and just kind of keep trying iteratively. Okay, let me see if I can get this to work. While this engineer knew the limitations of AI, so knew when he had to go in and manually solve problems, and then he'd also context switch really well while waiting for the prompts. He would switch and work on other tasks so that he could finish this productively.
That's interesting. You said the study was with a group of experienced developers. I'm definitely curious about the less experienced developers in this situation too, like the folks who are now growing up with AI and don't necessarily have the non-AI struggle that a lot of us have been through. Of course, leaning on Stack Overflow and Google was always part of the solution in our case, but now with AI, I think a lot of junior developers are able to get to a solution quicker, whether it's high quality or not. So what are your thoughts around the future of developers, especially given, right, the heavy use of AI by juniors?
I think I think I'm my opinions about the future is always low confidence in that, but I think that you'll start to see a separation between those who are critical thinkers about how they use AI versus just accept the response or are just trying to see if it meets the bare minimum. There are folks who will try to understand how it works, understand the limitations, and really know when to use AI and when to solve a problem manually, when they should learn about something versus when they can rely on AI. And being able to understand that context will be huge. There are others who will try to solve AI with everything, and that I think will fail.
Interesting. Because and they don't necessarily have the experience or desire to discern, right, what is actually solvable with AI versus not. Is that part of what you're sort of hinting at?
To me, it's like
a broad
who use
stroke brush, right? Like AI will do everything. I'll just go to that first, and I don't necessarily have to learn whether or not it's even applicable.
Yeah, like the best like analogy I can think of is like folks who like overused WebMD, where they only use WebMD and they're constantly thinking I'm going to get cancer, versus those who use it for when they have like, I don't know if I have a cold or a flu, or like what are some of these like early symptoms. I'm going to use it lightly, and I'm also going to consult my doctor and like talk to a human who has like more experience, more context, and like can check for like, okay, it's going to take out a thermometer and like run some other tests on me. So I think one is there are folks who exclusively use WebMD and are constant hypochondriacs versus those who use it cautiously and use it with a real doctor.
How do you learn to be experienced enough, right, to do that? And I think this is another question that I was going to ask. As a dev, where should you be spending your time? You know, is it debugging AI output? Or is it maybe I have a little bit of writer's block, so I'm just going to use AI to create an initial version of something. And then I'm just going to take it from there and run with it. I'm not going to sit there and fiddle with the AI to try to get it to fix itself or fix its output. I'm going to take what they created, what the AI assistant created, and I'm going to iterate on it for my own learning, but also maybe potentially to get to the solution quicker.
So an example I can think of, I think, is like bug bounty hunters might actually learn really quickly. Reason being is that instant gratification that I talked about earlier, where we're starting to see like the bug bounty space change, where a lot of folks are using AI in order to identify new threats, generate reports. And so there is a way to there are times where you should be kind of like manually looking for these vulnerabilities or trying to chain them together. And there are times where you should be leaning on AI to help you look for things you might have missed. And so being able to switch when you need to use it, you'll get that immediate feedback, which I think is really important, right? It's you learn through feedback. And the feedback you get with bug bounty reports is, did you get paid or not? And so that starts to become really real. And it's also the amount of time that you put in. Bug bounty hunters are extremely aware of how much time that they're putting in for the payout, and they can never guarantee that. And so if they put in a lot of effort just for one finding to get like the prompts to work and for it to find something, and it led to a $100 reward, or it led to, this is an informational finding, we're just going to give you points on the platform, they're going to go, okay, this didn't work, I need to iterate on this strategy. And so I do think bug bounty hunters will be really, really great at knowing when to switch between working on something themselves and knowing the limitations of AI versus actually building tooling, building reports, building functions, and relying heavily on AI.
Yeah, you know what you're touching on, I think we could expand on a little bit here too, because you're talking about incentives, right? And what's actually rewarded in order to influence behavior. Let's shift that to the developer lens for a minute, right? What is incentivizing them that they could shortcut toward using AI potentially? Or in other words, I'm thinking about, a certain level of quality that might be required versus just making it work. If it's just make it work, then, shortcutting through the AI to make something work is one path. Using AI and refining the response and maybe even spending, your own time manually refining the output to create a higher quality level of code is a different incentive. And I think that's completely controlled by leadership, more or less, and what they are emphasizing or even rewarding. So what are your thoughts around that?
That's why I pivoted to bug bounty hunters, because it's really clear they're not salaried workers. There is that monetary incentive. Their time is really valuable because they can tie it back to that reward itself. And they are their own bosses to an extent, versus different leaders, you'll get different results, right? There are some folks that say, I am just counting the lines of code that you commit, the amount of features that you've shipped. They don't care about the quality. And so I do think it's really, really important for folks to align themselves with strong leadership that can see beyond just the pure operational metrics, especially in this environment now where folks can ship a lot more quickly. But who's to say if there's just like filled with like 80% AI slop? And so that's why I pivoted directly to bug bounty. It is a lot clearer. It is a lot more measurable to them in a way that matters than it does for an engineer who, depending on their manager, depending on their leadership, that can look really different. And getting that feedback is really, really difficult.
I think there's a few things to talk about there. One of the things that I'm concerned about that I bring up often is something you said around the bug bounties. Time is really valuable because their effort is directly tied to the income that they make. But that's not true for salaried workers, right? Or to what extent is that true for salary workers? And is that a concern? Because to me, that's a concern. You know, it's almost like, hey, I've already got this income coming, you know, whatever. Like if I'm less efficient at this certain thing, it just doesn't have as much of an impact to me because I'm still making the same amount at the end of the day. And then to further exemplify the problem here, I think a lot of folks working at corporations, et cetera, consider salaried employees as almost like free labor or labor that it doesn't matter if they try to make them more efficient or not because it's not going to affect the bottom line enough to incentivize changes there. And I think that for me, this
I have
is
a little bit
of
of
mind. Please share.
Yeah.
Please share. Go ahead.
I actually don't think that's the case anymore with the number of layoffs and with a lot of people like saying like AI will overtake your jobs, is that you actually find a lot of people who are working really, really hard and working more hours or trying to be a lot more productive with the same exact pay. That pressure is there. It's no longer, oh, you can get like a sweet job like super easily, just like like do some leak code and you're done and you've got like 6 offers. Like I don't think we're in that environment anymore. And so what in fact happens is actually just like, how do I appease my manager? And I've seen this feedback a lot where it says like managers hold too much power. They're the ones who determine my livelihood. They're the ones who determine everything. And so then you have engineers not aligned with like real incentives, but aligned with what is the manager incentivized by, which may or may not be wrong. And so that's where I go back to the example of if your manager is incentivized by how much you ship, it's not a great environment to be in all the time because you're incentivized to ship poor quality, but like high throughput work. And so that's where I get through this. I can see bug bounty hunters learning a lot through the use of AI. I can see developers, it working well for some, but not all.
Got it. Based on their manager, more or less. It's interesting. I think I agree for the most part. You mentioned it's not a great environment if the manager is incentivizing the wrong things. To some degree, this is where appsec plays a part because some of our role is to influence what managers incentivize, right?
Yep.
So there's a bit of this culture shift and culture change that ideally we would be able to induce across the environment so that managers incentivize their developers differently. What's your experience with that? Like, to what extent are there challenges in this area? How have you tackled the culture change issue?
I love this question. So yes, that is exactly where I get to. That's like a lot of where my opinions are formed, where I constantly hear about the overburdened engineer and they're trying to get this shipped, but they run into all of these blockers that the company mandates them to get through. So it's got to go through a security review, got to go through the legal review, got to go through the privacy review, got to make sure this new feature is successful. And they have all of this on their burden, and their manager is saying, ship faster, ship faster. And they're thinking, please just help me get through the security review in one piece. I need to ship that. And so how do you work with these engineers? And so a lot of it is, one is showing a lot of empathy to this engineer and making sure that the security requirements you do give them are the ones that are required for this point in time, right? Not trying to overburden that engineer. The other is working with the manager and the leadership team. Let's say that they have a large amount of security debt. It's not one single person's fault. And so working with them to kind of build this culture of embracing and recognizing working on security debt. And so that does require at times a strong vulnerability management program, so you can measure the amount of debt in different parts of the org and work closely with engineers on incentivizing getting this work done, and also going through threat models, going through the different security processes. And that does really require just like a huge culture shift, and it can be really, really slow because it requires the engineer can be fully on board, but if their leadership doesn't value security work, that can be really difficult. So it's getting all different types of leaders to agree that this is really valuable work, that if we can work on this will enable us to move faster and a lot more efficiently.
This is democratizing vulnerability management, which I think you've spoken about quite a bit. How do you go about this, changing mindset to take this seriously? You mentioned this is a long journey. We're actually going to run out of time here in a little bit, but I feel like we just walked into quite the topic. Maybe give a couple little tips, hints, etc., in terms of how people should go about this culture transformation that you're talking about.
So I went a lot more into depth in my B-Sides SF talk, but one of the things I talked about, it's not just purely metrics. It's not just like measuring the number of vulnerabilities, reporting it to a leader and saying like, you're doing a great job, you're doing a bad job. That actually just incentivizes bad behavior because you just incentivize the kind of throughput of fixing vulnerabilities and not necessarily the culture of security, because it's just, I'm going to close out a ticket as quick as possible, but you don't actually get to the root cause of some of the security vulnerabilities. And so a bigger thing is a culture of trust. So that's like a really vague term, but really it's, you have to trust your engineers, recognizing some of those like qualitative metrics or like those stories that you can attach and highlight are really important, because then it'll incentivize others to do the same, where they go above and beyond in security. I'm a really proponent of just recognizing good security partners and highlighting when security gets recognized. Those are really huge for me. And so I think if you were to start something, it's recognize someone today, tomorrow, for being a great security partner. And I think you've made huge strides in starting to shift that culture of valuing security in a really visible way.
Yeah, as opposed to punishing folks, right? The complete opposite. You did something bad, we're going to make an example out of you. Yeah, I think that's fantastic. I do think positive reinforcement, right? Highlighting when folks are doing something that you desire, and doing that in, if they appreciate it, some sort of public way as well, right? We just want to highlight this person because they've done an amazing job reporting this issue that we wouldn't have known about otherwise, or whatever it is. I think that's a good place to start for folks who want to start to induce that culture change. And that might be a good place for us to start to wrap up. Unfortunately, our conversation, I've really enjoyed this. I would love to leave the audience with a takeaway. Ariel, do you have something that you can give the audience to kind of walk away and remember and apply as they go forth?
So I think big one for me is to always stay critical, whether it's you're working with a new AI tool, whether you're kind of working through the same exact process of your role management process that you've been working with years, is to apply a critical lens and think about, is this the right way to be using this? Is this the right context that this needs to be done in? And seeing through kind of what are the other possibilities out there? So always staying critical.
That's fantastic. Well, I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you for signing up to be part of this. So with that, we will wrap up this episode of the Security Champions podcast. Thanks for being here. I'm your host, Dustin Lair. We were here with Ariel Shin. Again, thanks a lot, Ariel, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks.